Captain Lisa Morgan, a decorated member of the Special Forces, was finally returning home after a grueling 18-month mission overseas. She had spent the last year and a half leading high-risk rescue operations, navigating treacherous terrains, and making decisions that could alter lives in mere seconds. Despite her accolades and undeniable skills, Lisa preferred to keep a low profile. For her, the idea of walking through an airport in uniform, drawing attention to herself as some kind of hero, was out of the question. She was a soldier, not a celebrity, and today she just wanted to blend in with the crowd and enjoy her anonymity. Dressed in a casual yet striking red and black tracksuit with a hood pulled over her head, she carried a beaten-up leather duffel bag slung over her shoulder. The bag, faded and stitched at the corners, wasn't just luggage, it was a memento of her countless travels and a reminder of the life she had chosen. Inside were a few modest souvenirs from her time overseas, handmade trinkets from the locals she had befriended, a small box of sand from an ancient temple she had visited on her last mission, and a journal filled with hastily scribbled reflections on the moments she wanted to remember. These keepsakes held far more value to her than the medals and commendations she often left buried in a drawer at home. The airport was bustling as usual, filled with travelers weaving their way through security lines, lugging suitcases, and chattering into phones about delayed flights and last-minute gate changes. Lisa navigated the chaos with a calm efficiency, the kind of quiet composure that comes from years of operating in high-stakes environments. Her dark eyes scanned her surroundings, not out of paranoia but out of habit. A soldier is always aware of her environment. It wasn't something she consciously thought about anymore, it was muscle memory. Lisa had arrived early for her connecting flight and found herself with a couple of hours to spare. She decided to grab a cup of coffee and browse the shops to kill time. The terminal had a typical array of chain restaurants, overpriced kiosks, and gift stores filled with t-shirts, keychains, and other trinkets no one needed. As she strolled through one of the larger souvenir shops, she took her time examining the rows of items on display, carefully selecting a few gifts for her younger brother and her niece. Her brother would appreciate the leather wallet. She found it was simple, durable, and practical, much like him. For her niece, she chose a stuffed animal wearing a t-shirt with the name of the city printed across its chest. It wasn't much, but she knew it would make the little girl's face light up. As Lisa made her way to the counter to pay, her sharp instincts picked up on a commotion at the other end of the store. A loud, aggressive male voice cut through the hum of the terminal's ambient noise. "You think I'm blind? I saw what you did. Don't lie to me." Turning her head slightly, Lisa spotted the source of the outburst. A uniformed police officer, tall, broad-shouldered, and visibly angry, was towering over an elderly black woman who appeared confused and frightened. The woman, dressed in a simple beige coat and holding a cloth shopping bag, was backing away slightly, her hands raised in a gesture of both compliance and fear. It was clear that she wasn't sure how to respond to the officer's accusations. Lisa's initial instinct was to stay out of it. She wasn't in uniform, and she wasn't in her jurisdiction. But as the officer's voice grew louder and his gestures more threatening, a sense of unease began to settle in her chest. This wasn't the kind of calculated intimidation a professional law enforcement officer used to maintain control of a situation. This was something else, something personal, fueled by anger and, perhaps, something darker. The officer jabbed a finger in the woman's direction. I said, "Open the bag. You think you can just waltz in here and take what you want? You people are all the same." Lisa felt her stomach churn at the words. She had seen this kind of behavior before, an abuse of power cloaked in the veneer of authority. She could feel the tension in the air, and she wasn't the only one who noticed. Other shoppers were starting to glance over, some frozen in place, others moving away to avoid getting involved. Most looked uncomfortable, but no one intervened. Lisa set her duffel bag down on the counter and stepped forward. Her voice was calm but firm, cutting through the officer's tirade like a sharp blade. "Is there a problem here, officer?" The man turned abruptly, his glare now focused on Lisa. For a moment he seemed taken aback by her presence. She stood tall, her athletic frame giving her an air of quiet authority, despite her casual attire. "This doesn't concern you," he snapped. "Move along." Lisa didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, her voice even. "Actually, it does. She looks scared, and you're yelling at her in a public place. I'd say that's everyone's concern." The officer's face flushed with anger. His name tag read Dawson, and the way his jaw clenched told Lisa he wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone he couldn't immediately intimidate. "This woman was shoplifting," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Stay out of it before you get yourself in trouble." Lisa glanced at the elderly woman, who was shaking her head vehemently, tears brimming in her eyes. "I didn't take anything," the woman said in a trembling voice. "I was just looking." Dawson stepped closer to Lisa, attempting to assert his dominance. "I'm not going to tell you again," he said through gritted teeth. "Back off." Lisa's calm exterior didn't waver, but her muscles tensed beneath the surface. She had faced down far more dangerous men than Officer Dawson, and his attempts to intimidate her were almost laughable in comparison. But this wasn't about her. It was about the woman behind him, whose voice had been silenced by fear. "Officer Dawson," Lisa said slowly, her voice steady as a rock. "You're escalating a situation that doesn't need to be escalated. Let's all take a breath and handle this the right way." Her words only seemed to stoke his anger. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he barked, his hand moving toward the radio clipped to his shoulder. "You think you can tell me how to do my job?" Lisa tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I'm just someone who's not afraid to hold you accountable." Dawson's knuckles whitened as he gripped his radio. His frustration was palpable, and Lisa could see the moment his judgment gave way to pure emotion. He didn't see her as a threat, just another civilian daring to challenge his authority. That was his first mistake, and it wouldn't be his last. Officer Dawson's temper was like a coiled spring, ready to snap. His face was flushed, veins standing out on his neck as he glared at Lisa. The moment she had stepped in, his grip on the situation had started to slip, and he could feel it. The elderly woman, still trembling, stood frozen behind him, clutching her bag like it was a shield. Dawson's entire demeanor screamed frustration, but Lisa remained calm, her posture unshaken. She had been in far more volatile situations than this, and she wasn't about to let his bluster intimidate her. "Step back," Dawson growled, his voice low and threatening. He was now inches from Lisa, his bulky frame casting a shadow over her. "You're interfering with police business. If you don't, I'll have you detained for obstruction." Lisa didn't move, her steady gaze locked on his. "Detained for what?" "Asking you to do your job properly." Her voice was measured, her words deliberate. They weren't meant to provoke, but to challenge him to think, to realize he was overstepping. She had seen this pattern before: an officer letting his ego drive his actions, creating a situation that could have been resolved with patience and tact. But Dawson wasn't hearing her. He was too far gone, too wrapped up in his need to reassert control. Behind them, a small crowd had started to gather, passengers pausing in their rush to board flights or browse stores. They watched the scene with wary curiosity, whispers rippling through the group. The tension in the air was palpable, like the crackling silence before a thunderstorm. Some looked nervous, while others appeared angry at Dawson's aggressive behavior. The elderly woman tried to say something, her voice soft and hesitant, but Dawson didn't even turn to acknowledge her. His focus was entirely on Lisa now, the woman who dared to stand in his way. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Dawson hissed, his tone dripping with disdain. "You think you can just walk in here, play hero, and undermine me?" He jabbed a finger at her, the gesture aggressive enough to make some in the crowd flinch. "This is my jurisdiction, and I'll handle it how I see fit." Lisa didn't flinch, though every fiber of her being was now on high alert. Dawson was spiraling, and she could see the signs: the clenched fists, the rapid breathing, the way his eyes darted to the gathering crowd, his frustration growing with every passing second. She needed to defuse this, but she also knew that any sudden move could push him over the edge. "This isn't about me," Lisa said calmly, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "It's about how you're treating her." She nodded toward the elderly woman, who was now visibly shaking. "She's scared, and you're not giving her a chance to explain herself. That's not how this should go, officer." Dawson sneered, his lips curling in a mix of anger and contempt. "You don't know a damn thing about how this should go. She's guilty as hell, and you're just another busybody sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." He took a step back, his hand moving to the radio on his shoulder. "You know what? Fine. If you want to play this game, let's play. You're under suspicion too." The crowd murmured in disbelief at his words, but Dawson ignored them. He grabbed the mic attached to his radio, his voice sharp as he barked into it. "Unit 45 requesting backup to Terminal C. Possible obstruction and interference with an investigation." Lisa's jaw tightened as she listened to him escalate the situation unnecessarily. His voice was loud enough to carry through the terminal, drawing even more attention to the scene. She could see people pulling out their phones now, their cameras aimed at Dawson as he squared his shoulders and stared her down. The elderly woman, caught in the middle, looked utterly terrified. She clutched her bag tighter, her lips trembling as she finally spoke up. "Please," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. "I didn't do anything. I swear, I was just looking. I don't even know what he's talking about." But Dawson didn't even glance at her. He had tunnel vision now, his eyes locked on Lisa as if she were the real threat. "You've got 10 seconds to back off," he said, his tone cold and flat. "Or I'll cuff you right here." Lisa could feel her patience fraying. She had tried reasoning with him, but he was too far gone, too determined to assert his authority at any cost. She wasn't afraid of being arrested, far from it. But the idea of letting this man bully and intimidate an innocent woman while abusing his power was something she couldn't stomach. "You can't arrest me for standing here," Lisa replied, her tone steady but firm. "And you definitely can't arrest her without cause." Her eyes flicked to the crowd, who were now openly murmuring in support. "You've got witnesses, officer. Think carefully about what you're doing." Dawson's face twisted into a scowl. "Witnesses," he snapped. "You think I give a damn about that? You think anyone here is going to stop me from doing my job?" He turned to the crowd, his voice rising in volume. "Move along. This doesn't concern you." But no one moved. If anything, the crowd seemed to solidify, their presence a silent but powerful statement of resistance. Lisa could see the cracks forming in Dawson's confidence, the way his eyes darted from her to the crowd and back again. He was losing control, and he knew it. Last chance, he spat, his hand moving to the cuffs on his belt. "Step back, or I'll kick." Before he could finish, Lisa's voice cut through his threat like a whip. "Or you'll what, officer? Violate my rights? Use excessive force in front of all these people?" She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "You don't know who I am, do you?" For the first time, Dawson hesitated. It was subtle, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a momentary pause in his movements. But it was enough for Lisa to press on. "I'm giving you a chance," she said, her voice low and measured. A chance to walk away from this before you make a mistake you can't take back. Think about it. Is this really how you want this to go? Dawson's grip on his cuffs tightened, his knuckles white with tension. The crowd was completely silent now, all eyes on him. The weight of their stares seemed to press down on him, but his ego refused to let him back down. He was trapped, too proud to admit he was wrong, too angry to think clearly. "I don't need your damn advice," he growled. "You're just..." But before he could finish, a voice crackled through his radio. "Unit 45, this is Command. What's your status?" The interruption broke the spell, snapping Dawson out of his spiraling anger for just a moment. He fumbled for the radio, his voice tight as he responded. "Situation under control. Backup not needed." Lisa raised an eyebrow at his words but said nothing. The crowd began to shift slightly, their attention flicking between her and Dawson as they waited to see what would happen next. The elderly woman took a cautious step back, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. Dawson lowered the radio, his jaw clenched as he glared at Lisa. "You think you've won," he muttered under his breath. "But you're just making it worse for yourself." Lisa didn't respond. She simply stood there, her calm presence a stark contrast to his simmering rage. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive, as the standoff stretched on. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And she knew that whatever came next, she would have to be ready. Dawson's face was a storm of conflicting emotions: anger, humiliation, and the simmering frustration of a man who felt the situation spiraling beyond his control. His grip on the cuffs at his belt tightened, and Lisa could see his knuckles whitening under the strain. The gathered crowd was no longer a passive backdrop, they were a looming presence, watching intently, murmuring amongst themselves. The weight of their judgment was palpable, pressing down on Dawson's shoulders and feeding the fire of his frustration. The elderly woman, still clutching her bag, looked ready to collapse. Her face was pale, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She glanced from Lisa to Dawson and back again, as if searching for some kind of resolution in their silent standoff. Lisa could see the fear in the woman's eyes, the way she clutched her bag like a lifeline. It was a fear Lisa had seen too many times before, a fear rooted in powerlessness, in the knowledge that sometimes the truth didn't matter. And Lisa knew she couldn't let that fear win, not here, not now. Dawson finally broke the silence, his voice sharp and cutting as he barked at the woman. "Put the bag down, now." The elderly woman flinched, her hands trembling as she slowly lowered the bag to the floor. Her eyes darted nervously to Lisa, silently pleading for help. Lisa held her gaze for a moment, a subtle nod of reassurance passing between them. Then, turning her attention back to Dawson, she took a step forward, placing herself squarely between him and the woman. "That's enough," Lisa said firmly. Her voice was calm but carried a weight of authority that even Dawson couldn't ignore. "You've made your point. She's not a threat. Let her go." Dawson's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching as he stared her down. "Step aside," he growled. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job." Lisa didn't move. Her stance was steady, unyielding. "Your job," she said evenly, "is to protect and serve, not to intimidate, not to escalate, and definitely not to target innocent people because you're having a bad day." Dawson's face flushed a deeper shade of red, his composure cracking under the weight of her words. "You don't know anything about me," he snapped. "You don't know what I deal with every day, the kinds of people I have to handle." Lisa tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "And you don't know anything about me. But I can tell you this, I've dealt with people far more dangerous than you, in situations far more intense than this. And do you know what I learned? The moment you let your emotions take control, You've already lost." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder as Dawson's frustration boiled over. He stepped closer, his movements jerky and aggressive, like a predator circling its prey. "You think you're some kind of expert? Some kind of authority? Let me make one thing clear: this is my jurisdiction, my rules. And if you don't back off, I'll make you regret it." Lisa's expression didn't waver. She stood her ground, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to Dawson's rising anger. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly. "This is your jurisdiction, and that means you have a responsibility to act with integrity. Right now you're failing." Dawson's hand shot out, grabbing her arm in a vice-like grip. The crowd gasped audibly, a ripple of shock spreading through the gathered onlookers. The elderly woman let out a soft cry, her hands flying to her mouth. But Lisa didn't flinch. Instead, she locked eyes with Dawson, her gaze steady and unyielding. "Let go," she said, her voice low and calm, but with an edge of steel that cut through the air like a knife. Dawson hesitated, his grip tightening for a fraction of a second before he released her arm with a shove. Lisa took a step back, adjusting her stance but never breaking eye contact. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, the silence broken only by the soft buzz of the airport intercom in the background. "You've just made a big mistake," Dawson said through gritted teeth. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Lisa raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "Neither do you." Dawson's frustration boiled over into action. He reached for his radio again, barking into it with renewed fury. "Back up to Terminal C. Now, we've got a situation." Lisa's eyes flicked to the crowd, taking in their expressions of shock and outrage. Some were holding up phones, not to film but to call airport security. Others stood frozen, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. She could see the cracks forming in Dawson's facade, the way his hands shook slightly as he lowered the radio, the way his eyes darted nervously around the room. And then, as if on cue, a new figure entered the scene. A tall man in a dark suit, his presence commanding and authoritative, stepped through the crowd. His sharp eyes scanned the situation, taking in the scene with practiced efficiency. It didn't take long for his gaze to settle on Lisa, and when it did, his expression shifted ever so slightly, a flicker of recognition passing across his face. "Officer Dawson," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" Dawson turned to face him, his frustration spilling over into his response. "This woman is obstructing an investigation and interfering with police business. I've called for backup." The man raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking to Lisa before returning to Dawson. "And what exactly is the nature of this investigation?" Dawson hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the question. "Suspected shoplifting," he said finally, his tone defensive. The man's expression didn't change. "I see. And do you have evidence to support this suspicion?" Dawson bristled, his shoulders stiffening. She was acting suspiciously. "I was following protocol." The man's gaze hardened, his calm demeanor taking on a sharper edge. "Protocol does not include manhandling innocent people or escalating a situation unnecessarily. I suggest you take a step back and let me handle this." Dawson opened his mouth to protest, but the man held up a hand, cutting him off. "Now." The authority in his voice was undeniable, and Dawson reluctantly stepped back, his posture stiff and resentful. The man turned to Lisa, his expression softening slightly. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked. Lisa nodded, her calm composure unshaken. "I'm fine." "But she's not," she gestured toward the elderly woman, who was still standing frozen, her bag clutched tightly in her hands. The man nodded, his gaze shifting to the woman. Ma'am, I apologize for the way you've been treated. If you'll allow me, I'd like to make this right." The woman nodded hesitantly, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. The man turned back to Lisa, his gaze sharp and assessing. "And you," he said quietly, "thank you for stepping in. But I have to ask, who are you?" Lisa hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Finally, she squared her shoulders, her voice steady as she replied. "Captain Lisa Morgan, United States Special Forces." The man's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. But he recovered quickly, nodding in acknowledgement. "Captain Morgan, it's an honor." Dawson's face went pale, the color draining from his cheeks as the realization hit him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked from Lisa to the man in the suit, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. The man turned back to Dawson, his voice cold and unyielding. "Officer Dawson, you've made a serious error in judgment today. I'll be reporting this incident to your superiors, and I strongly suggest you reconsider your approach to law enforcement." Dawson stammered, his confidence completely shattered. I didn't know." "That's the problem," the man said sharply. "You didn't take the time to know. And now you'll face the consequences." The crowd erupted in murmurs of approval, their earlier fear replaced by a sense of justice. Lisa watched as Dawson stumbled back, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his humiliation. She felt a surge of satisfaction, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was only one small victory in a much larger battle. As the man in the suit turned back to her, his expression softened. "Captain Morgan, if there's anything I can do." Lisa shook her head, her voice firm but polite. "Just take care of her," she nodded toward the elderly woman, who was now being gently escorted away by another officer. The man nodded. "Consider it done." Lisa took a deep breath, the tension in her chest finally beginning to ease. She turned and walked away, the weight of the moment settling over her like a heavy cloak. She knew this wasn't the end, it never really was. But for now, at least, justice had been served. The tension in the terminal lingered like a thick fog, even after Dawson had reluctantly stepped back, his face still pale with the realization of his misstep. Lisa watched as the elderly woman was gently escorted to a quieter corner of the terminal by the man in the dark suit, whose authority and composure had diffused the escalating situation. But Lisa wasn't naive enough to think that the ordeal was over. Dawson was still lingering, pacing in short, agitated bursts, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His ego had been bruised, his authority questioned, and she could see that he wasn't the type to let such a perceived slight go unanswered. Lisa shifted her stance slightly, positioning herself where she could keep an eye on Dawson without looking like she was watching him too closely. Her military instincts were on high alert now, every movement in the terminal registering in her peripheral vision. She noted the way Dawson's jaw tightened as he glanced toward the small crowd that still hovered nearby, their whispers audible enough to sting his pride further. He was cornered, trapped in the reality that his actions had been publicly called into question, and Lisa knew that cornered men often made reckless choices. The man in the suit returned to her side, his steps brisk but deliberate. Up close, Lisa noticed the gold badge clipped discreetly to his belt. Federal security, she guessed, likely someone high up in the airport's internal operations. His sharp eyes met hers, and there was a flicker of something unspoken between them, a mutual understanding of the delicate line they were both walking. "Captain Morgan," he said, his tone low but firm. "The woman is being taken care of. I've ensured she'll be escorted to her gate and provided with assistance for the rest of her journey. She's shaken, but she'll be okay. Lisa gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. Thank you. That's what matters. The man hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. I'm Special Agent Harris, he said finally, extending a hand. Head of Airport Security. And while I appreciate your intervention, I have to ask, are you willing to formally report what you witnessed here today? Lisa met his gaze evenly, her hand gripping his in a firm shake. If it comes to that, I will. But right now, my priority is ensuring that nothing like this happens again while I'm still in this terminal. Harris's lips quirked in a brief, knowing smile. Understood. Let me assure you, I'm already taking steps to handle the situation. Lisa's attention shifted briefly as Dawson stopped pacing and turned his sharp glare toward them. The anger in his eyes was almost tangible, his frustration boiling over as he took a few deliberate steps in their direction. Harris noticed it too, his body tensing slightly as he adjusted his stance. Lisa felt a prickle of unease creep down her spine, her muscles instinctively bracing for what she knew was coming. You think this is over? Dawson spat, his voice low but laced with venom. He stopped a few feet away, his posture rigid, his hands still clenched at his sides. You think you can just waltz in here, undermine me, and walk away like nothing happened? Harris stepped forward, his expression a mix of calm authority and subtle warning. Officer Dawson, I strongly suggest you take a moment to reconsider your next words. This situation is already well beyond your control. But Dawson wasn't listening. His gaze was locked on Lisa now, his resentment festering into something darker. She's not even law enforcement, he snapped, his voice rising. She had no right to interfere. You should be questioning her, not defending her. Lisa took a deliberate step forward, her calm composure a stark contrast to Dawson's unraveling anger. I didn't interfere, she said, her tone measured but firm. I stepped in because you were out of line. There's a difference. Dawson let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Out of line? You don't know the first thing about what it's like to be on the front lines, dealing with the kinds of people I see every day. You have no idea what I've... Stop, Lisa cut him off, her voice sharp enough to make him flinch. Her eyes were steady, her tone carrying the weight of someone who had seen more in a single mission than most would see in a lifetime. I know exactly what it's like. And let me tell you something, Officer Dawson, real strength isn't about shouting people down or flexing your authority. It's about knowing when to de-escalate, when to listen, and when to put your damn ego aside. The crowd, which had thinned slightly but still lingered nearby, murmured in agreement. Dawson's face darkened, his hands twitching at his sides as though he was debating whether to lash out or retreat. Harris stepped forward again, his presence a silent but undeniable barrier between Dawson and Lisa. Enough, Harris said, his tone brokering no argument. Officer Dawson, you are officially relieved of your duties for the remainder of your shift. You will report to my office immediately following this incident for a full review of your actions. Dawson froze, his expression shifting from anger to disbelief. You can't be serious, he said, his voice a mixture of indignation and desperation. I was doing my job. Harris's gaze hardened. Your job does not include escalating situations to the point of endangering innocent civilians, nor does it include targeting individuals based on personal biases. Consider yourself lucky that I'm giving you the opportunity to explain yourself later, rather than escalating this further right now. Dawson's mouth opened and closed as though he was struggling to find a response. Finally, with a frustrated huff, he turned on his heel and stormed away, his boots echoing loudly against the terminal floor. The tension in the air eased slightly with his departure, though the crowd remained, their expressions a mix of curiosity and quiet approval. Harris let out a slow breath, turning back to Lisa. "Thank you for keeping your composure," he said, his tone sincere. "That could have gone much worse." Lisa nodded, though her mind was still racing. "You handled it well. But something tells me this isn't the last I'll see of him." Harris frowned, his gaze following the direction Dawson had disappeared. "You're probably right," he admitted. "Men like him don't take humiliation lightly. I'll make sure he's monitored for the rest of his shift." Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line, her thoughts turning to the woman Dawson had targeted. "What about her?" she asked. "Is she safe?" Harris gave a small nod. "She's already being escorted to her gate. I've instructed my team to keep an eye on her until she boards her flight." Lisa relaxed slightly at his words, though a lingering unease remained. She glanced at her watch, noting the time. Her own flight was still a couple of hours away, and the idea of sitting idle in the terminal didn't sit well with her. She looked back at Harris, a hint of determination in her eyes. "If you need me," she said, "I'll be around." Harris gave her a knowing look, his lips twitching in a faint smile. "Noted." As Lisa turned to leave, she could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, their silent acknowledgement of what she had just done. She didn't bask in it, didn't let it linger. She had done what was right, what she always did, and that was enough. But as she walked away, her senses remained on high alert. Men like Dawson didn't let things go. And Lisa had a feeling this was far from over. Lisa hadn't made it far from the scene when she caught the faint but familiar sound of quick, heavy steps echoing behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Dawson. His presence loomed like a dark shadow, the weight of his anger pressing against her back. She slowed her pace deliberately, her soldier's instincts kicking in. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, faster, until they abruptly stopped a few feet away. "You think you can walk away from this?" Dawson's voice came low and sharp, almost a hiss. It carried a venom that hadn't been there before, his bruised ego now fully fueling his fury. Lisa turned slowly, her movements calm and deliberate. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes were sharp, taking in every detail of the man before her. Dawson's face was a mask of barely controlled rage. His fists clenched and unclenched at his sides, and a slight tremor in his shoulders betrayed just how close he was to losing control entirely. "Officer Dawson," she said evenly, her voice low enough not to attract immediate attention from passers-by but firm enough to carry authority. "You've already been relieved of duty. I suggest you take this time to reflect on your actions." Dawson took a step closer, his body language openly aggressive. "Don't you dare talk down to me," he snapped. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Walking in here like you own the place, making me look like a fool in front of everyone." Lisa didn't flinch, her stance unwavering. "No one made you look like a fool, officer," she replied. "You did that all on your own." The words hit him like a slap. Dawson's face twisted, his composure breaking further. For a moment it looked like he might lunge at her, but he stopped himself, his breathing ragged and uneven. His eyes darted around the terminal, taking in the thinning crowd of passengers who were still casting wary glances in their direction. Then, his gaze snapped back to Lisa, filled with a desperate need to regain control of the situation. "You think you can just waltz in here, flash your military rank, and everyone will bow down to you," he spat. "You don't belong here. You don't know what it's like to be on the ground, dealing with this crap day in and day out." Lisa tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanging. "I don't belong here," she repeated, her voice dangerously calm. "Officer Dawson, I've spent years in the field, facing situations you can't even imagine. I know what it means to de-escalate, to lead, to protect. And I also know when someone's let their power go to their head." Dawson's nostrils flared, and he took another step forward, now close enough that she could see the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. His voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "You don't get to lecture me. You don't get to stand there and act like you're better than me." Lisa held her ground, her voice firm but steady. "This isn't about me, Dawson. This is about you and the choices you've made today. You let your ego take control. You targeted someone vulnerable and escalated a situation that could have been resolved peacefully. And now you're trying to blame me because you can't face the consequences of your own actions." Dawson's face twisted in fury, and for a moment, Lisa thought he might actually snap. But instead, he stepped back, his hand flying to the radio still clipped to his belt. His fingers hovered over the button, and his lips curled into a bitter sneer. "You think you're untouchable," he growled. "But let's see how untouchable you are when I call this in." Lisa's eyes narrowed slightly, her posture shifting just enough to put her weight on the balls of her feet. "Call it in," she said coolly. "But let me remind you, officer, that everything you've done here today has been witnessed. By me, by Agent Harris, by a crowd of civilians. So go ahead. Call it in. But be prepared to answer for every decision you've made." Dawson's hand hesitated over the radio, his confidence faltering. He glanced around again, his eyes darting to the security cameras mounted on the terminal walls. For the first time, he seemed to realize just how trapped he was, how every move he made was being documented, watched, and scrutinized. The tension between them was a live wire, crackling in the air around them. Lisa could feel it, the fragile balance that could tip in either direction. She didn't want it to escalate further, but she was ready if it did. Her body remained still, but her mind was already calculating every possible outcome, every move she might need to make. Finally, Dawson lowered his hand, his shoulders slumping slightly as his anger gave way to a bitter resignation. But the venom in his eyes remained, a promise that this wasn't over. "You'll regret this," he muttered, his voice low and filled with malice. "You'll regret ever crossing me." Lisa's gaze didn't waver. "No, Dawson. The only person who'll have regrets is you." Before he could respond, a sharp voice cut through the tense silence. "Officer Dawson." Both Lisa and Dawson turned to see Agent Harris approaching, his expression a mix of authority and exasperation. His steps were quick and purposeful, and his gaze locked on Dawson with a pointed intensity. "Did I not make myself clear?" Harris said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You were relieved of duty. That means you leave the terminal immediately. Or do I need to have security escort you out?" Dawson opened his mouth to argue, but Harris held up a hand, silencing him. "No more excuses. No more justifications. You've already crossed every line today. Don't make it worse for yourself." For a moment it looked like Dawson might defy him, his jaw clenching as he glared at Harris. But then, with a muttered curse, he turned on his heel and stormed away, his footsteps heavy with frustration. Harris watched him go before turning back to Lisa. His expression softened slightly, but there was still a hint of tension in his eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked. Lisa nodded. "I'm fine." Harris studied her for a moment, then sighed. "I've seen officers like him before. They don't take humiliation well. He'll be stewing over this for a long time." Lisa glanced in the direction Dawson had disappeared, her expression thoughtful. "He's dangerous," she said quietly. "Not because he's violent, but because he doesn't know how to admit he's wrong. That kind of mindset leads to bad decisions." Harris nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I'll make sure he's dealt with. But you should be careful. Men like him don't let things go easily." Lisa met his gaze, her eyes steady. "I can handle myself." Harris gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. I don't doubt that for a second. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the situation settling over them. Then Harris straightened, his professional demeanor returning. If you need anything, Captain Morgan, let me know. And thank you again for stepping in when you did. Lisa nodded, her voice quiet but firm. It was the right thing to do. Harris hesitated for a moment, then extended a hand. Lisa shook it, her grip firm and steady. Take care, Harris said, before turning and walking away. Lisa watched him go, her mind already turning over the events of the day. She knew this wasn't the end. Men like Dawson didn't just disappear quietly. But she also knew she couldn't let fear or caution dictate her actions. She had faced far worse than this, and she wasn't about to let one disgruntled officer shake her resolve. As she turned and walked away, the tension in her chest began to ease. She didn't know what would happen next, but she was ready for it. Whatever came, she would face it head-on, just as she always had. Lisa was sitting quietly in the corner of the terminal near her gate, her duffel bag resting by her feet. The chaos of the past hour was starting to settle, but her mind was still alert, replaying every moment of the encounter with Dawson. She knew his type: prideful, reckless, and incapable of self-reflection. Men like him didn't just fade into the background after being challenged. They festered, letting their anger grow, until it eventually exploded, a desperate attempt to reclaim the power they thought they had lost. Her instincts told her this wasn't over, and those instincts proved right when she saw him approaching from the edge of her vision. Dawson was no longer in uniform, his shirt untucked and his face red with rage. He had clearly abandoned all pretense of professionalism, his eyes fixed on her, with an intensity that sent a ripple of tension through her body. This wasn't about duty anymore, this was personal. Lisa didn't move, her posture relaxed but her senses on high alert. She could feel the storm brewing in every step he took, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides, the unhinged determination in his gait. Around her, the terminal buzzed with activity boarding calls over the intercom, passengers hurrying to their gates, and the occasional screech of luggage wheels. None of them noticed the impending confrontation, but Lisa's focus was razor-sharp. Dawson stopped a few feet from her, his chest heaving as he glared down at her. For a moment he seemed to struggle to find the words, his jaw working as if he were chewing on the anger that threatened to spill over. Finally he spoke, his voice low and venomous. "You think you're so damn righteous," he spat. "Walking in here, acting like you're better than me. You don't get to humiliate me like that and just walk away." Lisa raised her eyes to meet his, her gaze steady and calm. "This isn't about me, Dawson," she said evenly. "This is about you. You made choices today and now you're dealing with the consequences. That's not my fault." Her composure only seemed to infuriate him further. His face twisted in a snarl, and he took another step closer, towering over her as if his physical presence could somehow intimidate her. But Lisa didn't flinch. She had faced down men far more dangerous than Dawson, and his bravado was nothing more than a hollow attempt to mask his insecurity. "You don't get to talk to me like that," Dawson snapped, his voice rising. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through." Lisa's expression didn't change. "You're right, I don't know you. But I know this: a good officer doesn't let their emotions control them. A good officer doesn't abuse their power to feed their ego. And a good officer doesn't make a scene like this." Dawson's hands twitched at his sides, and for a brief moment, Lisa thought he might lash out. The tension in the air was electric, the space between them charged with unspoken threats. But before he could make a move, a new voice cut through the noise. "Dawson." Lisa turned her head slightly to see Agent Harris striding toward them, his expression thunderous. He moved with purpose, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the vicinity. Passengers began to pause, their conversations quieting as they watched him approach. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Harris demanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. "I told you to leave the terminal. I told you this was over." Dawson turned to face Harris, his face a mask of defiance. "You don't get it," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "She humiliated me. She made me look weak." "No," Harris snapped, stepping closer. "You made yourself look weak. You let your pride and your temper get the better of you. And now you're digging yourself into an even deeper hole." Dawson opened his mouth to argue, but Harris didn't let him. "This is done, Dawson. You're done. Turn around and leave before I have you escorted out in cuffs." For a moment Dawson looked like he might resist. His hands clenched into fists, his shoulders squared as he stared Harris down. But then his gaze flicked to Lisa, who was still sitting calmly, watching him with the quiet confidence of someone who had already won. The fight drained out of him all at once, his posture sagging as the reality of his situation finally hit him. "You think this is over?" he muttered, his voice bitter and low. "It's not. You'll regret this." Without waiting for a response, he turned and stalked away, his steps heavy and uneven. Harris watched him go, his jaw tight with frustration, before turning his attention back to Lisa. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone softer now. Lisa nodded, rising to her feet. "I'm fine," she said. "But I hope that's the last we see of him." Harris sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Men like Dawson don't let things go easily. I'll make sure he's dealt with, but you should stay on your guard." Lisa gave him a faint smile. "I always am." Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You handled yourself well today. Better than most people would have in your position." Lisa shrugged slightly. "I've been in worse situations." Harris's lips twitched in a brief smile, though his eyes remained serious. "I don't doubt it. But still, thank you. You probably saved that woman a lot of pain today." Lisa's smile faded slightly, her gaze distant. "It's what anyone would have done." Harris studied her for a moment, then extended a hand. "Take care, Captain Morgan. And if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." Lisa shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Agent Harris. And good luck dealing with Dawson." Harris's smile turned wry. "I'll need it." As he turned and walked away, Lisa let out a slow breath, the tension in her body finally beginning to ease. The terminal around her seemed to return to normal, passengers going about their business as though nothing had happened. But Lisa knew that the events of the day would linger in her mind for a long time. Men like Dawson didn't just disappear quietly, and she had no doubt that she would cross paths with someone like him again. But for now, she pushed those thoughts aside. She had a flight to catch, a home to return to, and a family waiting for her. And that was all that mattered. The boarding call for Lisa's flight echoed through the terminal, the automated voice calm and unbothered by the drama that had unfolded just moments ago. Lisa stood near the gate, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, as she glanced toward the bustling terminal behind her. Passengers were still milling about, engrossed in their own lives, oblivious to the weight that lingered in the air. Though she'd managed to defuse the situation with Dawson and ensure the safety of the elderly woman, the events of the day sat heavy in her mind. As she stepped into the boarding line, she felt the subtle tension in her body begin to loosen. The flight home was a symbol of the normalcy she craved after months of being overseas. It was supposed to be a moment of transition, of stepping back into a life where she wasn't constantly on high alert. But today had served as a harsh reminder piece. Wasn't something you stumbled upon, it was something you fought for, even in the most mundane places. The line moved quickly, and soon Lisa found herself settling into her seat by the window. She tucked her bag under the seat in front of her and leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. The steady hum of passengers stowing their luggage and finding their places was a comforting background noise, a reminder of the ordinary world she was trying to rejoin. But her mind refused to quiet. Images of Dawson's face, twisted with anger and bruised pride, played in her head. She couldn't shake the feeling that men like him were emblematic of a larger problem one she couldn't solve alone, no matter how many times she stepped in. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, ensuring everyone was buckled in and prepared for takeoff. Lisa opened her eyes as the plane began to taxi, her gaze drifting to the window. The lights of the airport blurred as the plane picked up speed, and within moments, the ground fell away beneath them. She watched as the city below grew smaller, the sprawling grid of streets and buildings fading into a tapestry of lights. For the first time in hours, she let out a slow breath, allowing herself to relax. At least for now, the immediate danger had passed. As the plane leveled out and the cabin lights dimmed, Lisa reached into her bag and pulled out the small journal she'd carried with her throughout her deployment. The leather cover was worn, the edges frayed from months of use. She opened it to a blank page, her pen poised above the paper as she tried to gather her thoughts. Writing had always been a way for her to process the chaos of her life, to make sense of the things she couldn't say out loud. But as she sat there, staring at the empty page, the words didn't come. Instead, her mind drifted to the elderly woman, her hands trembling as she clutched her bag. Lisa wondered if she had made it safely to her flight, if she was finally able to breathe freely after the ordeal. She thought about Agent Harris, his quiet determination to hold Dawson accountable. It gave her a glimmer of hope, though she knew better than to put too much stock in promises. Change was slow, and men like Dawson had a way of slipping through the cracks. Her pen finally touched the page, the words coming in a steady stream as she wrote. Today wasn't supposed to be a fight. I came here looking for peace, for a quiet transition back to normal life. But peace isn't something you find, it's something you create. It's something you defend, and sometimes it's something you demand from people who don't want to give it. Dawson wasn't just a man having a bad day. He's a symptom of a system that rewards power over empathy, control over accountability. Men like him thrive because too many people look the other way. Today, I didn't look away, and I won't tomorrow, or the day after that. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that change doesn't come easy. But it comes when enough people decide they've had enough. She paused, rereading the words, before closing the journal and tucking it back into her bag. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight attendants prepared for the night, the soft glow of individual reading lights creating a calm, almost serene atmosphere. Lisa leaned back, letting her eyes close as the steady hum of the plane lulled her into a light sleep. When the plane landed hours later, Lisa was one of the last passengers to disembark. She stepped into the terminal of her hometown airport, the familiarity of the space wrapping around her like a warm blanket. She saw her brother waiting for her at the arrival gate, his face lighting up as she approached. He pulled her into a tight hug, the kind of embrace that spoke volumes without words. "Welcome home," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. Lisa smiled, her grip on him tightening for a moment before she pulled back. "It's good to be back," she replied, though the weight of the day still lingered in her chest. As they walked toward the parking lot, her brother began talking about the family, about her niece's excitement to see her, and about the quiet life she'd left behind. But Lisa's thoughts drifted, her mind still stuck on Dawson and what his next move might be. She didn't fear him. Men like him thrived on intimidation, and she had no intention of giving him the satisfaction. But she knew the fight wasn't over. It never really was. When they reached the car, her brother glanced at her, his expression curious. "You okay?" he asked. Lisa nodded, though the answer wasn't entirely true. "Just thinking," she said. "A lot happened today." Her brother studied her for a moment before nodding. "Well, whatever it is, you'll handle it. You always do." Lisa smiled faintly, his words both reassuring and heavy. She climbed into the passenger seat, her body sinking into the familiar comfort of home. As they pulled out of the airport, she gazed out the window at the passing city lights, her mind already planning her next steps. Men like Dawson didn't disappear quietly, and neither would she. If there was one thing she was certain of, it was this: the fight for justice wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon. And Lisa Morgan was prepared to keep running, no matter how long it took.